Life as a Jedi, From Youngling to Master. Chapter 1. Outer Rim Origins. You were born under red skies and shifting winds on the Outer Rim world of Calvos II, a dust-covered planet that orbited a swollen, aging star. Life here was neither easy nor elegant. It was hard and raw, carved from soil that cracked like ancient parchment, and winds that sang mournful dirges through canyon ridges. There were no great cities here, no spaceports humming with interstellar commerce, only scattered settlements clinging to survival on the edge of forgotten trade routes, where moisture farms and scavenger clans traded water, ore, and scrap in desperate equilibrium. You knew from a young age that Calvos demanded patience and strength. It was not a world that gave anything freely. The days were long and scorching, the nights bit with cold. You grew up in a small homestead carved into the base of a mesa, where your family repaired vaporators, tamed lizard hounds, and harvested lichen crops that barely kept up with the nutritional quotas set by remote Republic administrators, who had never once set foot on your world. Your earliest memories were painted in shades of rust and gold, the distant silhouettes of vaporator stacks glowing against the setting sun, the hiss of condensers, the thrum of solar inverters as they drank what little energy the sky allowed. You remember the taste of iron in the wind, the endless search for fresh water, and the deep reverence your elders held for the weather. Because on Calvos, weather could mean life or death. Most days were ruled by routine, helping your father strip down salvaged droid chassis for workable parts, assisting your mother in bartering with off-worlders, chasing after older cousins through the jagged rock fields while pretending to pilot invisible starfighters. And yet, amid the toil, there was something different about you. Something quiet and nameless, like a constant echo just behind your thoughts. You noticed things others missed. You could hear the shift in wind before a sandstorm struck. You could sense tension before voices rose. Once, when your cousin fell from a cliff ledge, your scream had somehow slowed her fall, just enough. Everyone called it luck, but you knew better. You felt something else move through you in that moment, something alive. The settlers never spoke of the Force, not directly. It was a concept that belonged to the galaxy beyond the dust, beyond your sky. But sometimes you heard it mentioned in passing, in tales told under flickering power lamps, when elders recalled the Jedi. Guardians of peace and justice, they said. From the time before, Calvos was forgotten. Most people treated those stories like old ghost tales or frontier myths, only half believing them. But you listened differently. Your heart stirred when they spoke of glowing blades and warrior monks who could move objects with a gesture, hear thoughts, or see through lies. You had no frame of reference to understand it, only a yearning you didn't have words for, a pull, like gravity, but deeper. Everything changed on the third cycle of the harvest season, during one of Calvos's rare, dry monsoons. The storm hit in the early morning. High winds, crimson lightning, and clouds thick with static. You were in the southern ridge clearing storm drains when the transport arrived. It was a Republic diplomatic vessel, older class, its hull scorched with entry burns. Few ships came to Calvos anymore, and when they did, it was usually for trade or to collect reports from local monitors. But this ship bore a sigil you didn't recognize, a stylized emblem shaped like a flame rising from a hilt. The people gathered quickly. Outsiders were always cause for attention, but this one drew whispers. "Jedi," someone said. The word came like a breeze across still water. He stepped out slowly, his cloak trailing behind him, hood lowered to reveal a face worn, not with age, but experience. His skin was pale, lined by twin scars at his temple. He walked with no urgency, no arrogance. Simply presence. You felt him before you saw him, an odd sensation like being watched by a storm that hadn't yet arrived. His name was Master Dadrian Voss. He was assigned to an Outer Rim diplomatic circuit, ensuring remote settlements were still stable, safe, and not slipping into lawlessness. That's what the others were told. But you sensed there was another reason he had come. The adults didn't know what to make of him. They greeted him with cautious respect, offered him food, asked polite questions, but you couldn't stop watching. His every movement was measured, as though the very air around him adjusted to make room. You didn't realize you had been staring until he turned to look at you, truly look. His eyes met yours and the world seemed to tilt sideways. For a moment everything became quiet, even the storm. You felt a thread pull tight inside your chest. He said nothing to you that day. He simply watched from a distance as you worked beside your family, as you navigated the rocks with ease, as you calmed a spooked farm beast that had torn loose from its pen during the storm's last growl. But he saw something. That evening, after the meal, he approached your family and asked to speak in private. You were sent away, but you heard fragments. Sensitivity, testing, potential. Your parents protested. Your mother grew tearful. You were too young to be taken, too needed here, but even they could see it. Master Voss had seen something in you, something real. The stories were no longer stories. The next day, he tested you. In the wind-sheltered workshop where your family stored salvaged parts, he placed 3 objects before you, a metal disc, a glass orb, and a dull crystal. "Close your eyes," he said, "and tell me which one I'm thinking of." You tried to guess, but something deeper urged you to listen, not with your ears, but with the space between your thoughts. You reached with your awareness, hesitant at first, then focused. The image of the orb came into your mind. Bright, smooth, cold. "Good," he said simply. Then he asked you to make it move. You didn't understand how. You tried reaching out with your hand, then your voice. Nothing. "Still your breath," he instructed. "The Force doesn't respond to command. It responds to truth." So you sat still, focused, let your mind go quiet and felt it. A ripple. The orb shifted. Barely but undeniably. That was the moment. That was when the world changed forever. The next day he spoke with your parents again. He told them what it would mean. Life at the Jedi Temple. A life of discipline, detachment and training. A life of peacekeeping, service and sacrifice. There would be no visits home, no family reunions. Once you began the path, it would shape your whole life. The Jedi did not permit attachment, not even to the world of your birth. Your parents struggled to accept it, but deep in their hearts they knew the truth. You were already looking beyond the horizon. You weren't meant to tend vaporators forever. The Force had whispered a different destiny for you. When they gave their blessing, it was quiet, no grand farewell. Your mother gave you a small, worn pendant shaped like the sky flower that grew along the Mesa cliffs. "So you remember where you came from," she said, her voice trembling. Your father placed a hand on your shoulder and said only, "Be better than us." Then you walked into the desert with Master Voss. You left with nothing but your clothes and the memory of warm soil under your feet. The walk to the landing pad was long and silent, the stars beginning to bloom above you like holes punched into the sky. When the transport lifted from Carvos 2 and the red dust fell away beneath you, you looked down only once. The settlements, the ridges, the long silver glint of the vaporators shrinking into memory. Then the sky became black, and then blue, and then nothing but hyperspace. You sat in the passenger bay, strapped into a seat far too large for your frame, watching the stars become rivers of light, knowing that ahead of you was a place no one on Carvos had ever seen, a world of towers and temples, a place where the Force lived and breathed. You did not know what awaited you. You did not know the trials, the challenges, the great losses and victories to come. But you knew, with a certainty you could not explain, that you were not alone anymore. The Force was with you, and your path as a Jedi had begun. Chapter 2. Journey to Coruscant. The stars never looked so vast as when viewed from the viewport of a Republic transport vessel cutting through the void. Seated near the side of the main passenger bay, you peered out in quiet awe, watching the familiar systems vanish behind you and give way to the boundless, light-scattered unknown. You had never left your home world of Carvos II before, never seen the cold shimmer of stars unfiltered by a dusty atmosphere, or heard the gentle, mechanical hum of a ship that pierced the dark between planets. The ship wasn't luxurious, but it was clean and well-maintained, with blue-lined Durasteel corridors and padded seating. Around you sat a few other children, quiet like you, some human, some not. You didn't speak. None of you did. The silence was not fear, but anticipation. You were all being carried away from everything you had ever known, drawn by the gravity of something immense and mysterious. The Jedi. The moment the ship's hyperdrive engaged, everything changed. The stars outside twisted into lines, then blurred into the swirling tunnel of hyperspace. It felt like time itself stretched, like you were no longer moving through space, but through the very heart of the galaxy. For hours, you watched the blue tunnel shift and churn, entranced, until the transport began its slow emergence into normal space. There was a low whine, a subtle jolt, and then, there it was, Coruscant. Even from orbit, the galactic capital overwhelmed the senses. Unlike Carvos, where you could stand on stone and see the curvature of the land, Coruscant was a world buried beneath its own creation. You couldn't see oceans or forests, only endless towers wrapped in glowing lights, atmospheric lanes teeming with thousands of airspeeders, and layers of artificial terrain stacked from bedrock to sky. It was a city that never ended, a monument to civilization so large it had swallowed its own nature, and yet, amid that expanse, one structure called to you above all others. A Jedi Temple. It stood apart from the clusters of corporate spires and political citadels, its 5 towers reaching into the sky like fingers in meditation, arranged in perfect balance around a central dome. Its architecture was ancient and solemn, stone-colored, unadorned by the neon clutter of the city around it. Its presence was undeniable. The closer the ship drew, the more you could feel it, not in sound or sight, but in sensation, like a quiet resonance echoing through your very bones. You didn't understand it yet, but the Force lived there, thick and still, like the deep water of an untouched lake. The landing platform extended from one of the temple's terraces, open to the sky, flanked by stone pylons and guarded by temple sentinels who wore robes instead of armor and carried no visible weapons. Their eyes were calm, but their presence radiated quiet strength. As you stepped off the ship, the wind of Coruscant rushed over you, cooler than Carvos, but heavier with moisture and city-scented currents. You followed the others in a small group, escorted by a young Jedi Knight in light brown robes, who walked barefoot across the warm Duracrete. He said little, but offered a reassuring glance. You entered the temple through a wide archway adorned with ancient runes, into a world unlike anything you'd imagined. Inside, the Jedi Temple was vast and silent, not in the way of absence, but in the way of contemplation. Everything felt deliberate. Every step echoed lightly off polished stone floors, and every corridor seemed carved with purpose. You passed murals of Jedi in poses of meditation and defense, flowing water features that brought serenity to the air, and high-arched ceilings pierced by natural light from glass domes far above. The Force was palpable here, not as an energy or a weapon, but as a constant, a presence woven into the very structure, as if the temple itself breathed and listened. You were brought to the initiate halls, quiet dormitories where younglings lived and trained until selected as Padawans. The quarters were simple but elegant, constructed of smooth sandstone and quiet lighting. Each child was assigned a small sleeping alcove and a daily schedule. You were provided with simple robes, loose-fitting beige garments tied with a cloth belt, meant to symbolize humility and readiness to learn. There was no pomp, no ceremony, no reward. This was not a place to become powerful, it was a place to become worthy. Your first days as a youngling were filled with awe. You rose with the sun cycle bell and joined others in the meditation chamber, where Jedi instructors taught the practice of breathing and mindfulness. The sessions were quiet, structured, often guided only by the sound of water or the rustling of the wind through high windows. You were taught not to chase the Force, but to listen to it, to feel it not as a tool, but as an extension of yourself. Through these sessions you learned to identify your emotions, to name them without being ruled by them. Patience, stillness, presence. These were your first lessons. Following meditation, the day moved into instruction. The Jedi Code was not given as law, but as philosophy. You learned its stanzas line by line, each one explored and examined through quiet discussion and reflection. There is no emotion, there is peace. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge. You came to understand that the Jedi were not warriors, nor monks, but servants of harmony. The code was not a cage, it was a compass, one meant to guide action in a galaxy filled with shadow and temptation. In the afternoons, you studied galactic history, not from a single perspective, but from thousands. Jedi historians taught you about the Old Republic, the wars of unification, the rise and fall of the Sith, and the treaties that kept fragile peace among worlds. You examined the cultures of distant planets, the evolution of planetary systems, the languages of non-human species. The Jedi believed understanding the galaxy was necessary to protecting it. Knowledge, you learned, was a form of peace. But the most exciting and most humbling part of your training came with lightsaber instruction. The training sabers were real, but their energy was regulated, safe enough to prevent injury, yet powerful enough to teach respect. You trained in the initiate combat arena under the watch of experienced instructors, learning the basic postures of Shiaicho, the first and most fundamental lightsaber form. Your stance was corrected again and again. Balance was emphasized over power, flow over speed. You learned to feel the motion of your blade through the Force, to predict your partner's movement before it happened, not through sight, but intuition. Some excelled, others stumbled, but all were expected to persevere. Lightsaber training was not for victory, but for mastery of self. Beyond combat and theory, there were moments of quiet wonder. You visited the temple's inner gardens, carefully cultivated sanctuaries filled with rare flora, waterfalls, and quiet pathways where even masters went to find balance. You stood in the Hall of Thousand Fountains where water danced in gravity-defying spirals and heard lectures from Jedi artisans and philosophers. You even glimpsed the Grand Archives, a labyrinthine repository of knowledge containing ancient holocrons, scrolls, and data crystals collected from across the stars. You were told you would study there in time. The temple became a world unto itself. You memorized its halls, learned the quiet etiquette of its residents, and began to feel not just as a student, but as a thread in something larger. You saw Jedi of all ranks pass through its corridors, from fresh-faced Padawans to quiet, solemn masters with eyes that seemed to see beyond the present moment. Some offered nods, others walked in silence, but all carried the same stillness, the same humility. You understood now that becoming a Jedi was not about gaining strength. It was about learning to serve, to listen, to surrender. There were hard days, of course. You missed your home, you missed the taste of the air on Carvos, the familiar rhythm of tools in your father's hands, the dry warmth of a desert night. Sometimes, in the stillness of your sleeping alcove, those memories would rise like ghosts. But you were taught not to run from them, you were taught to honor them without attachment, to see them as part of your path, not the end of it. You were told again and again that not all younglings became Jedi. Some would return to their worlds. Others would find new paths in service to the Republic. Only those who proved ready would be chosen by a knight or master for the next step. You accepted that. You welcomed it. Every lesson, every meditation, every moment of failure became part of your growth. You began to feel the Force not as something foreign, but as a rhythm, a current always moving through you. In time, it was no longer something you reached for. It simply was. You were no longer a child from the edge of the galaxy. You were a student of the Jedi Order. And though your path was only beginning, the temple had become your home. Not because of its structure, but because within its walls you had been given purpose, and the Force was with you. Chapter 3. The Youngling Trials. Time within the Jedi Temple did not pass like it did in the outside world. There were no seasons, no shifting skies, no day-night cycle dictated by weather or nature. The temple was governed by rhythm, by balance. Each day a step in a slow, deliberate journey toward mastery. Your early years as a youngling became a dance between repetition and revelation, discipline and discovery. It was a life of simplicity and structure, yet one that continually peeled back new layers of your mind and spirit. You woke each morning to the tone of the temple bell, donned your robes in silence, and joined your clan of initiates for the first meditations of the day. The stillness was no longer foreign to you. It had become a friend, a familiar space in which you could listen not only to your thoughts, but to something beneath them. The quiet pull of the Force, the soft current that never ceased. You belonged to the Neluri clan, one of several youngling clans organized by age and progress. Your days were shaped by instruction, and your instructors were Jedi Masters who had long ago given up the path of adventure to guide the next generation. They did not teach with lectures or punishments. They guided through questions, through silence, through example. Master Thalor, a wise and aged Togruta who wore faded robes and walked with the aid of a carved wooden staff, oversaw much of your spiritual training. He spoke often of the two aspects of the Force that younglings struggled to understand: the living Force and the unifying Force. The living Force, he explained, was the energy of the moment, the bond between all living things. It was immediate, instinctive, the pulse of life itself. It was what you felt when a lizard scurried across your hand, or when you could anticipate another youngling's movement before it happened in sparring. It was vibrant and emotional, and it taught you to act with empathy. The unifying Force, on the other hand, was vast, eternal, the flow of time, destiny, and balance. It was what the Jedi Council contemplated in deep meditation. It guided the long arc of the galaxy's story, though it rarely whispered clearly to those still learning. You were encouraged to trust the living Force, to feel the present moment as a truth. But you were also reminded that even the present was part of a greater pattern. Alongside these lessons, you continued your physical training. Instructors guided you through the foundations of all 7 lightsaber forms, though Shicho remained your core discipline. It was the form of determination ideal for beginners, and it taught the value of wide arcs, basic footwork, and the rhythm of movement. You learned to block, to strike, to redirect, not with aggression, but with balance. Every movement was a conversation, not a conflict. Lightsaber training was demanding. Mistakes were common, bruises were expected, but over time you began to see beyond the blade. You could feel the intentions of your partner before they moved. You began to fight not with your arms, but with your awareness. Lessons in forceability were equally rigorous. You practiced lifting stones, balancing them in the air, holding them steady even when your concentration wavered. You learned to sense the feelings of others, not by observing their faces, but by stilling your own emotions and allowing their presence to speak. Master Sarin, a Mirialan known for his precise diction and sharp humor, trained you in the art of Force listening. The Force, he often said, is always speaking. You were merely learning to shut up long enough to hear it. He would set you in the center of a training room, eyes closed, and scatter objects around you. Then, with only the force, you would locate them, feel their weight, shape, and motion. It was not easy. Frustration often clouded your senses, but slowly, imperceptibly, you improved. Not all training was physical or mystical. You were immersed in the study of Jedi history. Holoscopes, archive simulations, and ancient teachings revealed a long, complicated legacy. You learned of the founding of the Order over 25,000 years ago, of the early conflicts between light and dark, of the 100-year darkness and the schism that led to the birth of the Sith. You studied the Jedi's involvement in galactic politics, their role in the Republic, and the delicate balance they walked between peacekeeping and power. The Order had made mistakes, great ones, and the instructors did not shield you from this. You were taught to understand that even those who followed the light could fall into pride, fear, or attachment. The Jedi were not perfect. They were seekers, guardians, servants of a greater truth. One of the most memorable teachings came from your visit to the Hall of Crystals, a small chamber within the temple that held ancient kyber crystals, retrieved from sacred worlds like Ilum and Jeddah. The crystals glowed faintly in the dim light, each one unique, resonating with quiet, harmonic tones that only those attuned to the Force could perceive. A Jedi's lightsaber, you were taught, was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of harmony. The kyber crystal was not simply found. It called to the Jedi. Each blade was born through connection, not control. You wouldn't receive your own crystal until much later, if ever. But already you began to understand the bond between Jedi and blade. It was sacred. You forged friendships in your clan, bonds built through sparring, shared failure, and quiet reflection. You never learned to cling. The Jedi taught that attachment led to fear and loss, but connection, they said, was natural. It was the difference between loving and possessing. You meditated on that often, especially during long walks through the temple's gardens, where bioluminescent plants from distant worlds glowed under the artificial night light. You shared meals, helped each other during tests, and laughed when the moment allowed. You were still children, after all, but children with a calling. And then, after cycles of preparation and study, came the initiate trials. They were not announced with ceremony. There was no great gathering or declaration. You were simply told one morning after meditation that it was time. You were led to a quiet chamber deep within the temple's inner sanctum, where a set of ancient doors awaited. Each youngling would enter alone. The trials varied from one initiate to another. They were not standardized. They were personalized, crafted by the Force itself, or perhaps by the deep wisdom of the Masters. You had no way of knowing which. When your turn came, your heart raced. You stepped through the doors into silence. Inside, the room was circular, lit from above by shafts of filtered daylight. At first, nothing happened. Then the air shifted. Shapes formed, illusions maybe, or memories. You saw yourself back on Carvos II, standing before your family's homestead. Your mother wept. Your father turned away. You felt the pull of guilt, of yearning. A voice, your own voice, asked why you had left. Then the image faded, and you stood in darkness. A shadow rose before you, a monstrous silhouette with a blade of fire. You reached for a weapon, but there was none. The creature charged, but instead of striking, you breathed. You centered yourself, and you spoke. You are fear, and I am not ruled by you. The illusion broke. A final vision came. Your clanmates in danger, trapped beneath debris in a collapsing tunnel. You had only moments. You reached with the Force, guided not by panic but by trust. The stones lifted. Your path cleared, and the chamber brightened with soft light. You were back in the circle, alone, but different. When the doors opened, the Masters awaited. They said little, only nodded. Later, you were called to the Hall of Balance, where your clan stood together. Each youngling had passed. Some bore tears, some carried silence. All were changed. You had faced not just skill and knowledge, but yourself, and you had prevailed. The trial was not a graduation, but a recognition. You were now more than an initiate. You were a candidate for selection. Somewhere, a Jedi Knight would watch your progress, and when the time came, you would be chosen. But for now, you stood in the heart of the temple, breathing in the stillness, feeling the Force hum around you like a quiet song. And you knew the path was real. The journey was yours. Chapter 4. Chosen as a Padawan. The day you were chosen as a Padawan did not begin with fanfare. It began, as so many days had, in the temple's meditation chambers, your body still, your mind centered, your breath merging with the living current of the Force. You had completed your initiate trials only weeks earlier, and though you continued to train with your clan, a quiet expectation had settled over everything. The lessons felt different now. Every movement in the sparring circle, every insight shared in the archives, every moment of stillness in meditation was not only for your own growth, it was being observed. Jedi Knights and Masters would occasionally attend your sessions, not to teach, but to watch. They moved among the younglings with practiced calm, noting not only skill but composure, instinct, presence. You could feel it in the air, a decision approaching, like a wave gathering its strength. When the night came for you, it was without warning. Master Keelan Ma, a human of lean build and unreadable expression, approached after a midday lightsaber drill. She wore simple, dust-colored robes, her long braid tucked beneath her hood, and carried herself with the fluidity of someone deeply attuned to their surroundings. She had fought in skirmishes along the mid-rim, served in border disputes, and even advised Republic senators on trade negotiations. You had heard her name in the whispers of the archives, but never imagined she would know yours. "You move with patience," she said, nodding toward your training posture, "but your eyes see too far ahead. That can be dangerous or useful." She studied you a moment longer, then added, "You will be my Padawan, if you are willing." There was no ceremony, no procession or grand proclamation, just the truth laid bare in a few measured words. You bowed, deeper than you ever had before, and accepted. That night you were given the Padawan braid, a symbol worn over the shoulder, a single woven cord that marked your path ahead. Your clanmates congratulated you with reserved pride. Some had already been chosen, others would follow. You slept alone that night in your new quarters, quieter, smaller, but entirely your own. The temple felt different now, not less sacred, but more distant. Your path was no longer one of many, it was now singular. Training under a knight changed everything. The group lessons of your youngling days were replaced with personal mentorship. Master Ma guided you not through lectures, but through action. She would often pose questions without context. What defines peace in a system at war? Can justice exist without attachment? When does silence serve the greater good? Your answers were never right or wrong. They were weighed, reflected upon, and sometimes left unanswered. She challenged you constantly, not with reprimands, but with standards. When you failed to lift a structure in training, she asked not why you had failed, but why you had doubted. When you hesitated in a political simulation, she did not criticize. You discussed the consequences of inaction together. In her presence, you began to understand the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Your training also became physical in new ways. The temple sparring chambers were replaced with field training in distant gardens, airspeeder hangars, and holographic conflict simulators. You learned advanced techniques of Soresu, the form of resilience, a defensive style favored by diplomats and guardians alike. You practiced mindfulness under duress, meditated in storm rooms designed to disrupt concentration, and engaged in verbal exercises with protocol droids trained in political rhetoric. But the most transformative moment came when Master Ma took you beyond the temple, for the first time, into the greater galaxy. You left Coruscant to board a compact Jedi diplomatic cruiser, the Vigilant Sway, its interior Spartan but efficient. It was your first time returning to space since the journey that brought you to the temple, but now you were not a child. You were an apprentice, a symbol of the Jedi Order, and the responsibility was no longer distant. As the ship jumped into hyperspace, your master explained your mission, a border system in the mid-rim Sereth V, where a water-sharing agreement between two settlements had collapsed after a major drought. It was a minor diplomatic affair in galactic terms, but for the people of Sereth, it was a matter of survival. When the Vigilant Sway descended onto Sereth V, you were struck by the contrast. The planet was green and humid, a world of thick forests and floodplains, a stark contrast to the stone corridors of the temple or the dry winds of Carvos II. You accompanied Master Ma as she met with local leaders in a public gathering hall made of woven branches and polished rootwood. Tension hung in the air like static. The two settlement leaders, both humans, both proud, accused one another of sabotage and hoarding. You stood behind your master, silent, absorbing everything. Her role was not to dictate, but to listen, to illuminate the truth through patience and observation. Later, as night fell and the negotiations paused, she asked your opinion. "What did you see?" she asked, as you walked along a path lit by bioluminescent insects. You spoke of the anger in the room, the distrust, but you also mentioned the shared anxiety behind both sides' words, the fear of losing not just water but control. She nodded. "A Jedi must listen with more than their ears," she said. "We do not take sides, we reveal balance." The next day she guided the two parties to share their concerns without accusation. She used pauses, questions, and gentle logic to let them see the faults in their own positions. By the end of the cycle, an agreement was reached. The settlements would alternate access to a central aquifer and construct a joint filtration plant overseen by neutral droids. It was not peace in the grand sense, but it was harmony restored, if only for now. This mission and others that followed began to reveal the true nature of the Jedi's burden. You traveled to worlds recovering from natural disasters, helping coordinate humanitarian aid while sensing the undercurrents of political manipulation. You escorted a senator during tense trade negotiations, bearing witness to the veiled language of Republic bureaucracy. You observed as your master refused to intervene in a local civil dispute, choosing instead to report to the council and allow the people to find their own path. These were not victories in the traditional sense. They were choices, measured, thoughtful, and sometimes painful. Your understanding of galactic politics deepened. You saw how the Jedi were respected but also resented. Some viewed them as relics, others as threats. Many believed the Order to be overly involved, or not involved enough. You learned to navigate Senate halls, to read the coded gestures of diplomats, to know when silence was more powerful than speech. You learned, most of all, that the Force did not always provide answers. It provided clarity, and with that clarity came responsibility. Not all missions were diplomatic. Some tested your courage. You once responded to a distress call from a mining colony where seismic tremors had caused massive collapse. You worked for hours alongside local rescue teams, clearing debris, lifting survivors with the Force, and calming panicked children. You did not fight, you served, and that, your master said, was the highest calling. Between missions, you returned to the temple periodically. The great halls now seemed smaller, less overwhelming. You walked them not as a child in awe, but as one who carried experience. You studied in the archives with purpose, trained with fellow Padawans who had seen what you had seen, and in quiet moments you meditated in the gardens, feeling the weight of your responsibilities settling upon your shoulders like a cloak of wind. Still, you were not burdened. You were becoming. Through your master's guidance, you began to understand that being a Jedi was not about standing apart from the galaxy. It was about living within it, serving without judgment and sacrificing comfort for truth. You were no longer merely learning the code, you were living it. And though the road ahead remained long, you had taken your first true steps into the galaxy as a Jedi Padawan. One day you would face the trials of knighthood, but for now you had a master, a mission, and the Force. And that was enough. Chapter 5, The Padawan Journey. The galaxy widened before you with every mission. What had once been vast and unknowable began to take shape, not just in maps or archive entries, but in the rhythm of your days, the smell of different air on different worlds, the textures of alien soil under your boots, and the countless faces you passed that carried their own histories and hopes. As a Padawan under Master Keelan Ma, you saw systems on the verge of war, civilizations in the twilight of peace, and cities rebuilding from ruin. You felt the pulse of a living galaxy, turbulent, wounded, and yearning, and you understood, more each day, why the Jedi existed. You traveled to the contested moons of Tyra 5, where border disputes between rival species had fractured once unified colonies. There, amid smoking settlements and cratered plains, you helped negotiate the safe return of refugees displaced by skirmishes. You felt the bitter edge of war not in battles but in broken families, in children clutching empty ration packs, in the hard eyes of soldiers too young to carry such burdens. You witnessed the town's governor lie to your face about withheld relief supplies, and when your master exposed him, you felt pride, but also sorrow. Justice was necessary, but even truth could wound. On another world, Zalith Prime, you helped rescue survivors from the wreckage of a collapsed monorail system during an orbital station malfunction. You lifted twisted Durasteel beams with the Force until your arms trembled, guided screaming civilians to safety, and quieted a dying child with a whisper of comfort. The pain of that mission never left you, nor did the gratitude in the survivors' eyes. It was in these moments, between action and emotion, that you began to understand the Jedi's greatest challenge, the balance between compassion and detachment. You felt deeply, you hurt for those who suffered, but you could not allow those feelings to control you. Master Ma reminded you constantly, compassion was not weakness, but attachment could become one. You learned to stand in the center of grief and still find stillness. You learned to act with heart but not with impulse. The code was not there to sever your empathy, it was there to protect your clarity. You had to feel everything, but serve only the will of the Force. Your bond with your master deepened during these trials. She was not expressive, not given to open praise or warmth, but her guidance was constant, her presence unwavering. You learned to read her silences, to recognize when she was teaching through action rather than words. In battle simulations, she tested your reflexes and judgment. On long journeys through hyperspace, she recited passages from ancient Jedi texts and asked Yoda's interpretations. In private moments, she shared stories from her own Padawan years, of mistakes made, lessons earned, and friends lost to darkness or death. You came to respect her not only as your teacher, but as your compass. She had been forged in fire and emerged with grace, and under her, so would you. One mission brought you to Dathos 3, a forested world that had once housed a Jedi outpost, long since lost during the Nile raids. A recent surge of unexplained Force activity led the Council to investigate. You and Master Ma descended into the ruins, moss-covered stone, shattered statues, and ancient script half erased by time. The presence of the Force there was heavy, oppressive. In the heart of the ruin, you faced a manifestation of your own fear, an illusion drawn from the lingering energy of trauma and battle. You stood before a shadow version of yourself, robed in black, lightsaber drawn, eyes cold with anger. It struck you, not physically but emotionally, with accusations you had never spoken aloud, that you would fail, that you would never be enough, that your compassion would lead to ruin. You were paralyzed, your breath shallow, the illusion towering. But you remembered your master's teaching. The only way to overcome fear was to face it. You stepped forward. The shadow dissolved. You emerged from the ruin, trembling but clear-eyed. That night, Master Ma simply said, "You listened." Not long after, the time came for your pilgrimage to Elam. The ice planet was sacred to the Jedi, a frozen, inhospitable world in the unknown regions, its surface lashed by endless blizzards and its core veined with kyber crystals that resonated with the Force. You traveled there with other Padawans, a silent group bundled in layered robes, each of you knowing that you were about to forge your most personal bond with the Force. As your shuttle descended through the storm, you felt a deep stillness beneath the howling winds, a quiet heartbeat calling from below. The temple on Elam was not built, it was carved, almost grown from the ice itself, designed to blend into the terrain, hidden from those who would defile its purpose. The gathering began with a ritual fast and a period of silent meditation. Then the great doors to the crystal caves opened. Each Padawan entered alone. Inside, the air was cold enough to bite your lungs. Crystalline walls glittered with frozen light. The cave twisted in impossible ways. Some paths narrow, others wide and echoing. You wandered for what felt like hours, your senses sharpening, your thoughts narrowing. And then, like the ringing of a distant bell, you heard it. A faint hum, deep and pure. You followed it, guided not by logic, but by instinct. At the end of a narrow corridor, half hidden behind a frozen curtain, your crystal waited. It pulsed with a soft blue glow, vibrating in tune with your heartbeat. When you reached out and touched it, everything fell silent. Your thoughts, your breath, the cold. All that remained was a sense of connection so profound it brought tears to your eyes. The return to Coruscant was filled with purpose. Under the guidance of Master Ma and the temple's engineers, you began constructing your lightsaber. The process was meticulous, sacred. You chose the hilt components, the energy modulators, the focusing lens. You meditated over every piece before assembly. Then, in the quiet forged chamber, you ignited your blade for the first time. Blue, clear and steady, a symbol of your path as a guardian. The blade hummed to life in your hand, warm despite the glow. It was not just a weapon, it was a part of you now. A whisper of your purpose. With your lightsaber at your side, your responsibilities increased. You took on more dangerous missions. You diffused a hostage crisis on the planet Malrix IV, using negotiation rather than violence. You helped protect archaeological dig sites on Ictoria, threatened by corporate sabotage. Once, during a sudden pirate raid on a trade convoy, you defended a vessel in open combat, your blade flashing against blaster fire, your stance grounded in the form you had spent years refining. You were not perfect. You stumbled, you failed, but each trial taught you more. You began to understand that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. You felt fear often, on the brink of conflict when lives depended on your next words. When you saw injustice you could not immediately stop. But you learned to center yourself, to breathe through it, to let it pass like a wave over stone. That line between fear and courage, between action and wisdom, was where the Jedi lived. It was where you lived now. And through it all, your master stood beside you. You were not equals, but the gap between you had narrowed. She began to trust you with decisions, to defer to your judgment in moments where once she would have directed. The braid on your shoulder felt heavier now, not with burden, but with meaning. You were no longer a learner standing at the edge of destiny. You were a Jedi Padawan walking the line with awareness and grace. Your blade had been forged, Your heart had been tested. The galaxy still trembled in places, fractured and bleeding, but you were ready to meet it. You were dead, but your light had died in. And the Force moved through you, quiet, sure, and alive. Chapter 6. The Trial of Knighthood. There comes a moment in every Padawan's journey when the road narrows and all paths converge upon a single threshold. For years you had trained under Master Keelan Mar's guidance, endured the rigors of the field, meditated in the stillness of the temple, learned the patience of diplomacy and the precision of combat. You had walked through war-torn cities and stood between the desperate and the dangerous. You had lifted the broken and stepped away from the glory. But despite all your experience, despite the trials you had faced in the field, the Jedi Trials, the formal, final tests of ascension, still loomed as something greater. They were not tests of what you could do. They were a crucible for who you were. The Council did not announce your trials with fanfare. There were no public declarations, no assemblies in the temple halls. Instead, you were summoned quietly to the council chambers. The room, circular and vast, was bathed in sunlight filtered through tall, transparasteel windows. The 12 chairs of the High Council, spaced evenly in a ring, bore the weight of centuries. Your master stood with you, silent but steady. You bowed before the gathered masters and waited. "You have grown in the Force," one of them said, their voice even, ageless. "You have served the Republic with compassion and courage. The time has come for you to face the trials." You bowed once more and said nothing. Words were not needed. Your heart was calm, your mind prepared. The trials would be administered in 4 parts: skill, knowledge, courage, and spirit, each designed not to test your memory or strength, but your readiness. You would face them alone in different corners of the temple, guided only by the Force and your own integrity. No 2 Padawans experienced the trials in the same way. The Force shaped them according to the individual. It was not ceremony, it was evolution. The trial of skill came first. You were led into one of the high-ceiling combat arenas beneath the temple, an octagonal chamber with adaptive walls, capable of shifting terrain, light, and climate. Your lightsaber hung at your belt, deactivated but ready. The room dimmed, and without warning the environment changed. You stood now in a simulation of an abandoned starship. Narrow corridors, flickering emergency lights, smoke curling from broken panels. Suddenly droids emerged, 4, then 6, then 10, each armed with stun weapons and programmed to move unpredictably. You activated your blade, its familiar hum rising like a breath, and fell into the rhythm of Form 3 Saucer, the defensive stance. You moved with precision, no fear, no waste. The Force guided your timing, your reflexes. You deflected blasts, disabled limbs, disarmed opponents. You never struck in anger. You never sought to destroy, only to endure, to protect, to outlast. The simulation escalated, new variables, tighter spaces, faster droids. But you remained centered. When the test finally ended, the walls faded back into durasteel, the smoke dissolved, and the masters nodded. You had passed. The trial of knowledge followed. Entered the great Jedi archives, vast and ancient, filled with countless holocrons, scrolls, and illuminated records of thousands of years of Jedi thought. You were presented with a single task: unravel a conflict hidden in a cluster of records, scattered across historical files, political reports, and personal journals. It was a mystery buried in truth, an ancient Jedi's failure that had led to an obscure planetary revolt. The lesson was not about finding the mistake, but understanding it, contextualizing the Jedi's role, interpreting the layers of culture, fear, and ambition that had driven the outcome. You studied for hours, sometimes days, piecing the puzzle together. You did not rush to judgment. You read both sides. You reviewed the code. In the end, you presented your conclusion: The Jedi in question had made the right choice by the code, but the wrong choice for the people he was sworn to protect. His failure was not in action, but in detachment, a reminder that wisdom must walk hand in hand with empathy. The Council accepted your answer, not because it was correct, but because it was considered. The trial had never been about the past. It had been about your insight into the future. The trial of courage came next. You were assigned a real mission, without your master. A diplomatic vessel in the Outer Rim had gone dark after sending a distress call. It was carrying Republic relief supplies and a medical team. You were sent alone to investigate. The ship had been attacked by pirates, its engines disabled, its crew scattered and wounded. You boarded the wreckage in orbit above an uninhabited moon, navigating flickering corridors and floating debris. The pirates had left, but a reactor breach was imminent. Thomas Godwin had made. You had minutes to stabilize the core. You found the surviving crew, frightened, huddled in a sealed galley, and calmed them with your presence, your words, your certainty. Then you moved into the heart of the ship. With the Force, you manipulated exposed cables, redirected cooling flow, and focused your awareness to locate the failing systems. Your robes were scorched, your fingers bled, but you did not break. You saved them all. When you returned to Coruscant, you did not speak of what you had done. Courage, your master had once said, is not proved in the moment of action, but in the moments after, when you choose humility over recognition. The Council said nothing more than, "We are pleased." The trial of spirit was last. It was the one no Jedi could prepare for. You were led into a small meditation chamber, bare of ornament, lit only by a single shaft of natural light. You were told to sit, close your eyes, and listen. That was all. Hours passed, perhaps days. Time lost meaning, hunger faded, thought faded, and then it began. Visions, emotions, memories. You saw your past, your childhood on Carvos II, your family's faces, the faces of those you could not save on missions, the wounded who had looked to you for help. You saw your darkest fears, yourself standing over the body of your master, having failed her. You saw yourself wielding your blade in anger, giving in to hatred. The Force showed you what could be, what might be if you lost your path, the temptation of power, the seduction of certainty, the loneliness of the light. You wept, you raged, you begged for silence. Then slowly you found it, not by resisting, but by accepting. You were not perfect, you never would be. The trial of spirit was not about triumph, it was about honesty. And when you opened your eyes again, the shaft of light still warmed your face. You had passed. Word came days later, a formal summons. You stood once more in the Hall of Knighthood, robed and clean, with your master at your side. Jedi from across the temple gathered in silence, forming a wide circle around you. The High Council did not speak a great deal. They did not need to. They had watched your journey. They had seen your truth. You knelt, your master stepped forward, she looked at you, not as a superior but as an equal. With a quiet motion, she drew her blade, ignited it, and held it gently to your shoulder. The hum filled your ears, not with threat, but with harmony. Then she lifted your Padawan braid and severed it with a single stroke. The room was silent. You rose. A Jedi Knight. Not a learner, not a child, a guardian of peace, a servant of balance, a voice for those who had none. You felt no rush of pride, no need for celebration. You felt only the quiet certainty of the Force flowing through you, strong, centered, alive. Your journey was not over. It had only just begun. Chapter 7. Missions of a Jedi Knight. Knighthood brought with it a strange silence, not the applause of completion, but the stillness of beginning anew. The braid was gone, the trials behind you, yet what stood before you now was not the reward of peace, but the responsibility of it. You were no longer a student guided step by step. Now, your choices carried weight. You answered to the Force and to the Code. The Temple provided guidance, but the path was yours to walk. And the galaxy, as you soon discovered, had no shortage of need. Your first assignments as a Jedi Knight took you far from the core worlds. The Republic, strained under the weight of expansion and old rivalries, dispatched Jedi to the Rim territories with increasing frequency. You were sent where the Senate could not go, where local governments faltered, where diplomacy failed before it began. Border worlds, trade routes choked by piracy, colonists in desperate need of mediation, this became your domain. On path thisforth, you negotiated the release of agricultural workers who had been seized by warlords following the collapse of a planetary alliance. The fields had gone dry and desperation had replaced reason. Your arrival was met with skepticism, but you stayed neutral, spoke with calm, and brought both sides to see the shared ruin their conflict had sown. A week later, they signed a treaty brokered by your patient insistence. No one thanked you, but the workers returned to their homes, and that was enough. On Galendri, a cold, wind-swept mining colony, you helped coordinate the evacuation of a settlement under siege from seismic instability. The colony's magistrate had refused to heed warnings, and when the ground finally gave way, thousands were stranded. You and a team of Jedi healers worked tirelessly, guiding convoys through collapsing tunnels, using the Force to reinforce weakened structures, and holding back rock slides that threatened to bury families alive. You slept, only in short intervals, eating ration packs in between search and rescue missions. In the final hour, you stood atop the ridge of the last buried chamber and reached with the Force to lift the debris, stone by stone, until the path cleared and those trapped inside emerged blinking into the pale sunlight. Your arms ached for days, but no lives were lost. Other assignments were less dramatic, but no less important. You were often tasked with escorting Republic diplomats through volatile regions. On one occasion, you accompanied a senior ambassador to the Tanshari system, where long-standing cultural disputes between two native species had fled into unrest. As a Jedi, you were both guardian and mediator. Your presence alone was often enough to prevent bloodshed, but you had to be more than a blade, you had to be a bridge. You learned to speak their languages, understand their histories, and identify the deep generational fears beneath the arguments. The Force guided you not through grand gestures, but through quiet understanding. You began to realize the power of listening. Your lightsaber, though always at your side, remained dormant for long stretches. It became not a weapon of violence, but a symbol of stability, of peace, of promise. In the few moments when combat was unavoidable, defending a convoy from raiders, deflecting blaster fire during a hostage extraction, you acted quickly and without hesitation. But the Jedi way was always to prevent violence before it could bloom. You studied local law, traditions, clan alliances. You trained in diplomacy and negotiation. You meditated daily, even when planetside, taking time in quiet corners, caves, or rooftops to center yourself. The Jedi Code was your compass. There is no emotion, there is peace. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge. And yet, questions began to grow. You saw systems where Republic aid never arrived, where bureaucratic inertia left worlds to suffer while senators debated trade percentages. You witnessed noble families manipulate laws to maintain control, and peace treaties signed in public only to be undermined in secret. You intervened to stop one civil war, only to discover your presence had inspired another faction to rise up elsewhere, demanding equal treatment. You began to wonder, were Jedi truly agents of balance, or were you tools of a Republic too entangled in its own ambitions? These doubts were not heresy. They were the natural evolution of a mind in service. The Code encouraged reflection, but you found yourself revisiting passages with new eyes. What did it mean to serve the Force when the institutions surrounding it were flawed? Could one truly remain neutral in a galaxy built on inequity? You began corresponding more frequently with fellow knights you had trained alongside. You exchanged hollow messages filled with reflections, questions, even frustration. Some shared your doubts. Others remained firm, reminding you of the wisdom of the Council and the importance of the Order's unity. Still, the questions persisted. You returned to Coruscant periodically, to rest, to report, to reconnect with the Temple. It was always a place of serenity, but now it felt different, quieter, perhaps more distant. You walked the halls with the knowledge that many of those around you had not seen what you had seen. The meditation gardens no longer offered the clarity they once had. You spent more time in the archives, reviewing ancient teachings, searching for writings from Jedi of old who had wrestled with the same dilemmas. Vision struck you, an account from a long-deceased master who wrote, "We serve not the institutions of power, but the harmony of the living. The code is not a leash, it is a light." You meditated on that sentence for hours, and slowly you began to reframe your path. You were not a diplomat, not a soldier, not a mouthpiece of policy. You were a Jedi, a guardian of peace. And peace could not be dictated from a Senate chamber. It had to be felt, lived, and shared. You carried that clarity with you into your next mission. A small colony on the moon, Eltros II, had fallen under the control of a charismatic warlord who claimed to speak for the Force, manipulating the local settlers with prophecies and promises. The Republic had deemed it a low priority, but the whispers of abuse reached the Temple, and you volunteered to investigate. What you found was a frightened population under spiritual siege. The warlord, once a failed student of a lesser temple, used fragments of Jedi language twisted to serve his ego. He spoke of fear as destiny, of violence as truth. His followers carried crude replicas of lightsabers and enforced his will with ritual. You confronted him not with anger, but with truth. You dismantled his rhetoric with patience. You exposed his lies not by force, but by revealing his fear. In a final confrontation, as his followers gathered with weapons raised, you knelt, unarmed, and asked them to listen. They did. The warlord was taken into custody without bloodshed. That mission restored something within you. It reminded you that the Jedi's greatest power was not in the blade or the code. It was in presence, in conviction, in the courage to speak when silence would be easier. You returned to Coruscant once more, older in spirit than you had ever been. You spoke with your old master in the Temple's quiet upper chambers. She listened as you shared your doubts, your trials, your moments of weakness. When you finished, she only said, "You're learning." The burden of a Jedi is not just action. It is introspection, doubt, choice. You continued to serve. You meditated often, sometimes beneath unfamiliar stars, sometimes in the quiet corners of ships as they sailed between troubled systems. You followed the code. You lived modestly. You offered your wisdom where it was needed, and your silence where it was wiser still. You defended the defenseless, and counseled the conflicted. But in the quiet of your mind, the questions remained. What was destiny? What role did the Jedi truly play in a galaxy constantly tearing itself apart? The answers were unclear, but the Force was still with you, and you were still listening. Chapter 8. Teaching the Next Generation. There comes a point in every Jedi's journey when the road bends back upon itself, not in retreat, but in return. After years spent in service across the stars, after conflicts resolved, crises weathered, and truths discovered beneath the silence of meditation, the call to teach arrived like a quiet whisper through the Force. It did not come from the Council, though they offered the opportunity. It came from within, a resonance, a subtle stirring that told you the time had come to pass on what you had learned. It was not a duty taken lightly. To take a Padawan was to take responsibility not just for another life, but for their place in the galaxy, and for your own transformation through them. Once you returned to the temple, not as a visiting knight, but as a teacher-to-be. You walked once more through the initiate halls, past clusters of younglings practicing meditation, repeating lines of the Jedi Code with careful reverence. You remembered your own first days, the texture of the stone beneath your bare feet, the way your voice shook as you whispered ancient words you did not yet understand. You watched now with quiet eyes, knowing how far the path stretched before them. The council presented you with a list of initiates who had completed their trials. You spent days reviewing holo-recordings of their training sessions, meditating on their profiles, speaking briefly with their instructors. But it was in the initiate gardens that you found your answer, a girl of Zabrak descent, named Linara Vel. She did not notice you at first. She was seated alone beneath one of the tall trees, meditating not with perfect posture or serene focus, but with tension in her shoulders, a quiet storm behind her eyes. When she opened them and saw you watching, she did not speak, but she did not look away. That, you felt, was honesty. Later, during a simple force exercise, she struggled to lift an object from the ground. Her frustration simmered just beneath the surface, controlled but sharp. Instead of pushing harder, she sat back, closed her eyes and began again. Slower this time, quieter. The object rose. You had seen enough. When you approached her formally and offered to become her master, she bowed quickly and accepted, but she did not smile, you understood. For a youngling, the moment of selection is not joy alone. It is the weight of the path becoming real. You saw in her the same focus that once lived in you, the same questions not yet voiced, the same hunger to understand. Training a Padawan was unlike any other responsibility you had known. It required constant presence, not just physical but emotional, philosophical. You became her mirror, her compass, her anchor. You taught her lightsaber forms each morning, beginning with the fluid arcs of Shijo and gradually introducing the precision of Makashi and the defensiveness of Soresu. She favored speed over patience at first, always seeking the next movement before mastering the last. You corrected her gently, then firmly, then through example, demonstrating that it was not the blade that mattered, but the rhythm between strikes, the breath between moments. In time, she learned to wait, to listen, to feel. You guided her through force meditation, encouraging long hours in the temple's quiet halls and garden chambers. She struggled to quiet her mind, especially in the early days. She would sit for hours and emerge with no clarity, her frustration barely hidden. You reminded her that the force was not always a voice, it was often silence, and learning to trust that silence was the first step toward hearing it. Eventually, she began to find peace in stillness, and once, after several weeks of struggle, she told you that during one meditation, she felt as though she had become part of the wind moving through the trees. That was enough. You did not shield her from the galaxy's pain. You took her with you on missions to outer systems, just as your master once had. You traveled to the Shandari Reach, where local governments had collapsed under economic strain and lawless syndicates had moved in. Together, you negotiated with regional leaders, protecting civilians while resisting the urge to solve every problem by force. Linara was quick to intervene in confrontations. Her heart guided her hands. But you reminded her that action without wisdom could create more harm than good. "We are not saviors," you told her once as you stood on a crumbling balcony overlooking a refugee camp. "We are guides. Let the people rise. We only lift where they falter." Slowly, she learned political neutrality. Not indifference, but discipline. She witnessed corruption, injustice, suffering, and with your help she responded not with outrage, but with resolve. You discussed each mission after its completion, not just for debriefing, but for reflection. You encouraged her to challenge your decisions, to ask hard questions, to express doubt. She did. Sometimes her questions echoed your own from years before. And when she asked, "How do we know we're doing the right thing?" you replied, "We don't. But we feel, we listen, and we act with clarity, not certainty." Your connection with her deepened. She became more than a student. She became a companion on the path. You saw in her moments of wonder, frustration, defiance, and humility. You offered what your master once gave you: presence without domination, instruction without ownership. You never expected perfection, only progress, and when she fell short, you helped her rise, not with reprimand, but with reflection. Back at the temple, your responsibilities grew. The council began to call upon you more frequently for advisory duties, gatherings of senior knights and masters to assess shifting galactic tensions. You spoke in council chambers about the impact of Jedi involvement in trade disputes, about the moral implications of neutrality during uprisings, about the strain on Jedi assigned to war-adjacent systems. You did not speak often, but when you did, others listened. Your voice was shaped not by theory, but by years lived at the edge of peace. You were asked to mentor younger knights who had recently passed their trials, offering guidance as they faced the same doubts and decisions you once did. You led group meditations, you taught seminars on lightsaber philosophy and force-assisted negotiation. You were asked to write entries for the archives on modern applications of the Jedi Code. You hesitated at first, wondering if you had enough wisdom to add to such a vast tradition, but eventually you wrote, "The Code is not a shield from complexity. It is the shape of our courage within it." One mission brought you and Linara to a world you had visited long ago as a Padawan. It had changed. New leaders rebuilt cities, a stronger local government. Some remembered you. A few even bowed. Linara noticed. "They treat you like a legend," she said, half in jest. You shook your head. "No, they remember what peace felt like, not who brought it." The mission ended without conflict, but it stirred something in both of you. That night, in the temple guest quarters, Lenora asked you whether she would ever feel ready to face the galaxy alone. You looked at her for a long moment, remembering yourself at her age, standing before your own master in doubt. "You won't feel ready," you told her honestly. "Not fully. But when the moment comes, the Force will know, and you will too." Years passed. Linara grew strong, not just in ability but in presence. She spoke with authority in council debriefings. She navigated disputes with clarity. She meditated in stillness for hours and emerged with insights that sometimes even surprised you. She made mistakes. She learned. And eventually, you knew before anyone said the words aloud that her trials were drawing near. You watched her face the trials with dignity. You did not guide, you did not interfere. You waited. And when she emerged from the final chamber, her eyes clear and her steps steady, you bowed your head. In the hall of knighthood, you stood before her as your master once stood before you. You raised your blade, you cut the braid, and in the hush that followed, you saw not a student, but an equal, a Jedi. You never spoke of pride. It was not the Jedi way. But as you walked the temple's quiet halls that night, you paused in the initiate garden, beneath the tree where you first saw her years before. You stood there for a long time, breathing, listening, remembering. The path continued, and the next generation was ready. Chapter 9. The Rank of Jedi Master. There was no ceremony, no golden declaration. The elevation to Jedi Master came, as all things in the Order should, with quiet clarity. You had long since stopped measuring your life in missions completed or titles gained. Years of service, instruction, and reflection had shaped you into something more enduring than a warrior or a negotiator. You had become a presence, a still point in the turning galaxy. The day the Council called you to stand before them, it was not a surprise. You had felt the motion within the Force, the gathering shift, but still, when the words were spoken, they resonated deeply. You have demonstrated mastery in skill, in insight, in spirit. You have served not only with wisdom but with humility. The Council recognizes you now as Jedi Master. No other words were needed. You bowed, not in triumph, but in understanding. With the title came new weight. Not more power, not greater command, but expectation. Where once you had followed the code and lived by its teachings, now you became a steward of those teachings. Younger Jedi looked to you as a beacon of guidance. Knights sought your counsel, not in moments of glory, but in moments of confusion. You found yourself less on the front lines and more in meditation chambers, archives, and strategic briefings. Your voice joined others in the halls where policy was discussed, where the fate of systems teetering on the edge of war was weighed word by word. You had spent your youth forging peace through action. Now, you forged it through presence. The Council offered you a place among them, a seat in the Ring of 12 that guided the Jedi Order's direction. It was not a position to be craved. The Council's burden was deep, to see far ahead and yet remain rooted in the moment, to guide without ruling, to deliberate in the shadow of galactic currents far beyond one's control. You did not accept immediately. Instead, you requested time for contemplation. The Force, you had learned, rarely shouted, it whispered. You returned to the uppermost meditation spire of the temple, an open, wind-kissed platform where the city's distant hums softened into silence. There, under a pale sunrise, you listened, and in that stillness you found your answer. You accepted, not for ambition, not for recognition, but because you had begun to see the Order in a way few could, not as an institution fixed in doctrine, but as a living organism, flawed, yes, but evolving. It needed voices rooted in experience, shaped not just by theory, but by pain, compassion, and service. Sitting on the Council changed your view once more. You no longer responded to the galaxy as it presented itself. You anticipated, you watched. You guided others as they stood where you once had. You read reports from Jedi watchmen stationed on Outer Rim worlds, weighed pleas from overburdened governors, reviewed diplomatic breakdowns that pointed toward deeper unrest. Every decision was tempered by balance. Every vote you cast considered not just the immediate cost, but the resonance it would carry across time. And yet you did not confine yourself to the temple. You spent stretches of time traveling as a watchman, an ancient Jedi tradition often forgotten by those who saw the Order as centralized on Coruscant. As a watchman, you did not wait for crises to reach you. You went to the edge of Republic space, to the half-forgotten systems where Jedi were not symbols but lifelines. You wore your robes plain, carried no entourage, flew a quiet vessel without escort. You moved among the people not as a master, but as a witness. You listened, you advised, you stood among market traders during droughts, among governors in collapsing states, among clan leaders facing civil division. You spoke less often, acted less visibly, but your presence brought stability. On the storm-choked world of Nivari, you spent weeks with a fractured planetary council, rebuilding trust among rival factions. On the colony world of Ravnoth, you helped evacuate thousands before a sun flare incinerated the northern hemisphere. You did not record these actions in great detail, you did not seek credit, but you saw them not as missions, they were harmonics in the symphony of the Force. Every world touched became a thread woven into the Order's living memory. As the years passed, you found yourself drawn more and more to the teaching of philosophy. You led holocron dialogues with older Padawans and knights. You gave private lectures on the balance between emotion and duty. You often said, "The code is not a wall to hold you in, it is a window to let the Force shine through." Your words were recorded, referenced, sometimes even misunderstood. You corrected gently. You never argued to win. You only offered what the Force had shown you. You wrote more, at the request of the archives, not essays of instruction, but reflections, thoughts on what it meant to walk the line between compassion and detachment, musings on the lives you had touched, the faces you still remembered, the mistakes you had made. You did not pretend to have all the answers. In fact, you wrote, if you reach a day where you believe yourself finished as a learner, you have stepped away from the Jedi path. You walked the temple gardens often, especially in the early hours. You greeted initiates and younglings with warmth, offered short bits of wisdom, asked them questions that had no clear answers. You became known not as a figure of power, but as a presence of patience. And yet, for all your peace, the galaxy grew louder. Conflicts began to spread more rapidly. The Republic, vast and aging, struggled to maintain unity. The Outer Rim bristled with unrest. Pirate activity spiked. Corporations pressed further into independent systems. The Senate grew more divided, and the Jedi, so long revered, were increasingly seen by some as enforcers of order rather than guides of balance. You felt the tension even among your peers. Council debates grew more heated, more political. The question arose again and again, how involved should the Jedi be? How far did duty extend? You offered your voice when needed, always tempered with caution. We must never confuse protection with control, you said once. The moment we rule through presence alone, we become a shadow of what we serve. There were times when you felt alone in the council chamber, even among allies, times when decisions were made that troubled you. But you never lost your center. You meditated more often now, not in search of serenity, but in search of clarity. The Force, you had learned, rarely confirmed, it only aligned. An alignment took effort. You visited your former Padawan, now a knight in her own right, perhaps even nearing the trials of mastery herself. You spoke as equals. She told you of her own doubts, her own struggles to balance service with self. You listened. You shared only one piece of advice. The galaxy is not asking you to be perfect. It is asking you to be present. Sometimes, late at night, you returned to the archives and reviewed old records of Jedi long past. Those who walked the line between war and peace, who guided the Order through its brightest moments and darkest mistakes. You felt kinship with them, not in legacy, but in burden. You understood, finally, that the Jedi were not icons of purity. They were beings walking a difficult path, constantly correcting, constantly adjusting to the living Force. You had once thought of the Jedi as a shield between the galaxy and chaos. Now you saw something deeper. The Order was a breath in the lungs of the Force. Sometimes strong, sometimes shallow, but always seeking balance. It was not perfect, it would never be, but it was necessary. You continued your work, some days in chambers, some days in the field, some days in silence. The galaxy moved, changed, rebelled, healed, and through it all you stood in quiet service. Not as a warrior, not as a ruler, but as a Jedi Master. And the Force moved with you still. Chapter 10. Legacy and the Force Beyond. The years drifted gently into decades. You came to understand that age was not measured in years, but in quiet transformations. The once young knight who had leapt from ship to planet, resolved disputes with a blade at their hip and fire in their eyes, had long since grown into something softer, but no less powerful. Your steps slowed. Your bones ached in the mornings. But your presence carried more weight than ever. Jedi passed you in the temple halls with bowed heads, not out of obligation, but reverence. You had become not just a master, but a part of the temple itself, a keeper of its breath, a witness to its time. Teaching remained your most profound act of service. No longer bound to one Padawan, you instructed dozens over the years, some formally, some only in passing. You led classes in advanced lightsaber philosophy where you taught not how to fight, but how to understand the intention behind each movement. You guided seminars in Jedi ethics, leading thoughtful debates that rarely had one answer but always had one purpose: to deepen the student's sense of service. You taught meditation techniques used by watchmen on long assignments in the Outer Rim, and you became known for your lessons that began not with teaching, but with listening. More than once, knights who had failed their trials came to you in quiet shame. You never offered them judgment. You walked with them through the gardens. You asked them to describe the moment they knew they had faltered. And in their own words, they always found the root of their weakness and the strength to try again. Many of them went on to succeed, not because of your wisdom, but because of your faith. The scrolls you wrote, bound in durable cloth and copied into holocrons, became part of the Jedi archives. You never wrote to elevate yourself. You wrote because memory was fragile, and wisdom earned through hardship deserved preservation. In your writings, you spoke of your early days on Carvos II, of the silence between blaster fire, of the weight of the blade, of the moments when compassion risked becoming attachment, and how you found the line between them. You never claimed to hold the final truth. You simply offered your path, your lessons, your hope that the next would walk it further than you had. The galaxy changed, as it always did. New wars rose on the edge of the unknown regions. The Republic expanded, then contracted. The Senate splintered, healed, then splintered again. Technology advanced. Cultures merged. Jedi who had once been your students became council members themselves. You watched with quiet pride and quiet concern. The Order endured as it always did, but it too transformed. The Jedi became more involved in galactic affairs than ever before. Some knights became generals, some became reluctant ambassadors, some questioned the role of the Order itself. You did not stop them. You guided when asked, you questioned when needed. But you knew, better than most, that each generation had to find its own truth. The Force flowed forward, not backward. Clinging to the past out of fear was not wisdom, it was stagnation. You served on advisory councils into your later years, your voice softer but no less impactful. You rarely left Coruscant now. The stars called to younger Jedi. Your path was here, among the roots of the temple, in the scrolls, the gardens, the quiet conversations that began with a question and ended with a spark of understanding. There came a point when the council stopped asking you to attend every meeting. You were not retired. Jedi did not retire, but your role had changed. You were a steward now, a living archive. Even the youngest initiates knew your name. They saw you in the gardens, tending to the flowering trees, feeding the rooftop birds by hand, meditating for hours in the Hall of Balance. They sat beside you sometimes, unprompted, and asked the kind of questions only the unshaped could ask. What happens when we die? Does the Force love us? Were you ever afraid? And always you answered gently, not with absolutes, but with stories. In time, your body weakened. You no longer taught formal classes. Your saber remained stored in a simple wooden case, resting beside a folded set of robes you hadn't worn in years. Your days became smaller in motion, but not in meaning. You dictated your final reflections to temple scribes. You met with students and masters alike for one last conversation, one last lesson, one last smile. Your name was spoken in hushed tones in the archives. Some called you the Quiet Master, others simply the one who waited. And then one morning in the deep silence before dawn, you rose from your bed, wrapped yourself in your oldest robe, and walked unaided to the temple's highest meditation spire, the very same place you had once gone before accepting your seat on the council. The sky was still dark, but the first sliver of sun crested the far edge of Coruscant's towers. You sat cross-legged on the stone floor, facing the light. Your breathing slowed, your awareness widened. You felt the temple below you, the city around you, the lives moving through shadow and peace, fear and hope. You felt the Force in its totality, not as a current to guide, but as a great ocean to return to. You closed your eyes, you did not fall asleep. You became one with the Force. The moment passed like a sigh on the wind. There was no flash of light, no storm, no echoing cry, only stillness. When a knight came to find you, hours later, they found only your robe, neatly folded, resting in the morning light. Your passing became a story whispered from one end of the temple to the other. Students asked where you had gone. The master said only, "He has joined the Force." A memorial was held, not grand, but deeply felt. Jedi of all ranks gathered in the garden to meditate in silence. The trees you once tended blossomed early that year. Your writings lived on in the archives. Your teachings passed from one generation to the next. Your former Padawan, now a senior master, quoted your words before each of her own students' trials. Your name appeared on walls not of honor, but of remembrance, a reminder that even the humblest journey can shape the stars. Years later, when a young Jedi questioned their path, a teacher would lead them to a quiet alcove in the temple. They would sit beneath a tree, open a worn scroll, and read. The Force does not end, it transforms, as do we. Be present, be honest, be ready. And the cycle would begin again. Your journey did not end, it expanded. You were the dust in the stars, the whisper in meditation, the warmth behind every choice made in peace. You were a Jedi, and you were never truly gone.